virus is the cause of a respiratory illness like the common cold. So this was like pre-COVID. I would ask this question to audiences, and 99% of the people would put their hands up. Yes, a virus is the cause. And then I would tell them about these experiments where really good experiments, really well designed, that replicated, where scientists would cloister away human subjects in hotel rooms and control what they slept, how they slept, what they ate, and so on. And then they would take exactly the same amount of dose of virus and put it into the nostril of each person. And only 20 to 40% of people, depending on the experiment, got sick with symptoms. So exposure to a virus is not the same thing as infection. And only 20 to 40% of people were infected. That means that a virus is not the cause of an illness. It is a necessary cause. You can't get sick. You can't get a common cold without a virus, but it is not the cause. Okay. What were the other predictors of who got sick? And they were things like childhood adversity, a history of childhood adversity, or chronic stress, or these things that we think of as more psychological. We think of them as psychological. There is a sort of a metabolic underpinning to them, but we think of them as psychological. But anyways, the point is that what predicted who got sick was also the state of that person's immune system, which is regulated by their brain. And that means that the state of your immune system is also, and your brain are also necessary, but not sufficient causes of illness. Now, I was president of the Association for Psychological Science, which is like the big, the big scientific, society that, and so I wanted to bring this to people's attention because what it means a couple of things. One is that people who are experiencing chronic stress, particularly people living in adverse circumstances, are going to be they're more likely going to be to get sick after exposure. They'll probably be more likely to be exposed too, but they'll be more likely to get sick from exposure. And the same things that predict whether you get sick also predict your immune response to a vaccination. Are we okay? Do we need to take a break?
No. I just want to ask you if you think this means that another way of dealing with a pandemic would be to address these collaborating factors that create infection and ergo potentially a pandemic.
Well, exactly. And I want to say that, but it gets to your point, looking for individual causes versus more system-based, like relational causes. And I guess that like illness is not doesn't have a simple single cause. There are a set of like a web or a network of potential causes that are all working together. And my point is that who gets sick isn't just a matter of who is exposed or what the viral load is. It's also a matter of that person's personal history, some of which is based on where they live. What access did they have to medical care? Did they live in poverty? Do they have the ability to get fresh food or fresh air or what have you?
And to further politicize this, if I may, Lisa, we only contemplate, consider and analyze solutions that are economically beneficial to, and we only present certain outcomes as favorable.
No, we don't even do that though, Russell. That's the totally infuriating thing about it, is that we don't even do that. Because can I tell you something? The National Academy of Sciences did a study. They did like a big study of childhood poverty, and they discovered that it would be cheaper to just eradicate. I mean, it would be expensive to eradicate poverty for children, but it would be cheaper to do that than it would be to deal with the consequences of that poverty, the way that it shapes the nervous system and the brain in those children, which sets them up for illness later in life. We still end up paying that bill. It's just a much bigger bill. It's
and
just
there's more suffering. So if it's not economically led, it's ideologically led, and it's sort of, in a sense, that speaks to some of the points that I'm making, that it's more favourable to have a solution that facilitates big tech having more access to people's lives and more access to track and trace data. Our systems favour a solution where big pharma gets the benefit and profit. These are the systems that we're heading towards, and what are these systems based on? Individualism. You are a separate animal running on these systems, what you can remember, what stimulus so what we need to divide is a kind of a scientifically underwritten myth that brings to the forefront collectivism, unity, togetherness, reverence and respect for individual forms of identity. But unless these myths are told, unless these stories are told, Lisa, we're in grave danger of, we're on the precipice of Armageddon, but the coronavirus is just but one example of how something that's apparently an objective reality, like you said earlier, all the coronavirus is seeking is a nice wet pair of lungs, but whose wet lungs, how many times, how often? Because otherwise, why is there a difference in what's happening in New Zealand or Taiwan or the US or the UK or Germany? Culture. So there's so many things, no objective reality. We create reality through our imagination.
Yeah, well, through our collective imagination. That's also the important thing. That this is something that I wrote about in my first book, How Emotions Are Made. But because it was a book about emotion, some of the bigger points got lost. And so I decided to kind of reiterate them in this smaller book, and also maybe sort of gently, maybe take my lab coat off a little bit at times, and maybe just try to ask people to think about what the implications are of some of these things. And for example, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a number of years ago now, based on this research showing that words, just simple words, actually have a huge impact on your nervous system. And I was being a little provocative, in the op-ed, deliberately provocative to get people to think, because that's what you do sometimes when you're a professor. You sort of say things that are slightly provocative to get people to think, maybe in a bit of a different way. Not that you want them to think anything in particular, but you just want them to think differently, like just get outside your usual way of thinking and just explore other ways of thinking a little bit. But can I tell you that the idea that that our nervous systems are socially dependent on each other. We are social animals. We evolved as creatures to influence each other's nervous systems in very profound ways. Other animals influence one another, with sights and smells and sounds and so on. We do that, but we also do it with words. You can read something that was written 2,000 years ago, and it can change your heart rate and change your breathing. I can text 3 little words to my friend who lives halfway around the world. She doesn't have to see my face. She doesn't have to hear my voice, but I can change her metabolism with those 3 little words, right? We have language. The parts of the brain that are involved in us speaking and understanding language are exactly the same parts of the brain that regulate your heart, your lungs, your immune system, and so on. So we have these socially dependent nervous systems, but we live in a culture that prizes individual rights and freedoms. That's a bit of a conflict. And it's a bit of a conflict that is worth having some discussion about, particularly when we find ourselves living in an environment, and even maybe cultivating that environment, of like cultural brutality, where people just say the most outrageous things to each other without thinking about the impact that those words will have, right? It's fine to have freedom to say what you want to say, but you also have to think about what the impact is of what you say. But can I just say, the amount of pushback that I got from that required 2 police forces to patrol my lab, patrol my office, patrol my house, I mean, it was really stunning.
Why, free speech?
Yeah, people thought that I was saying that there should be limits to free speech, and that's not what I was saying at all, actually.
If you're enjoying this conversation with me